At 72, alone in the operating room, I stared up at the hospital ceiling and wondered, where was my only son? I'd called him 14 times. 14 times. Not a single call was answered, and when he finally picked up, not to ask if I was okay, he just said, "Mom, please don't bother me anymore." That was the moment I understood. The son I'd raised for 45 years hadn't disappeared because he was busy. He disappeared because he was waiting for me to die so he could take my money. If you're reading this story, please like and comment the city you're reading from so I know how far my story has come. And please don't leave, because what happens next will hurt even more. The surgery was scheduled for 7 in the morning. I had been awake since 4, not because of nerves about the operation itself. I had lived long enough to stop fearing the ordinary kind of pain, the kind that comes with a blade and anesthesia and a clean white room. What kept me awake was something older and quieter and far more corrosive than fear. It was the waiting, the listening, the way my phone sat on the nightstand like a small, silent accusation, its screen dark, its silence so complete I could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls of my hospital room. Lucas had promised he would be there. He had said it 3 weeks ago, standing in my kitchen while I poured him coffee, and tried not to notice how his eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the driveway, toward anywhere that wasn't my face. "I'll be there, Mom. Surgery like that, you don't think I'd let you go through it alone, do you?" He had even squeezed my hand when he said it. A brief, firm squeeze, the kind that feels like punctuation, like a period at the end of a sentence you're supposed to believe. I believed it. That was my first mistake, though not my last. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 72 years old, and until the morning of March 14th, I believed, despite every piece of evidence that should have taught me otherwise, that my son loved me the way sons are supposed to love their mothers. Not perfectly, not without complication, but genuinely. Underneath all the distance and the missed birthdays and the phone calls that grew shorter with every passing year, I believed there was something real, something that would show up when it counted. I had been building that belief for 45 years, reinforcing it with small acts of willful blindness, choosing over and over again to see the best version of Lucas rather than the actual one. The morning of March 14th, that belief was still intact. By the time the sun set, there would be nothing left of it. My hip had been deteriorating for nearly 3 years. The orthopedic surgeon, a careful, precise man named Dr. Kaufman, had been patient with me. Patient in the way doctors sometimes are with elderly patients who keep finding reasons to delay. I was not afraid of surgery. I was afraid of what recovery would look like without anyone to help me through it. A woman my age, living alone in a house with 2 staircases, cannot simply go home from a hip replacement and manage. She needs someone. Meals, transportation. Help getting from the bed to the bathroom in those first raw days when the anesthesia is still leaving the body and the pain is something you have to negotiate with hour by hour. I had asked Lucas about this 6 months earlier, not as a demand, as a question, a gentle, careful question, because I had learned by then that asking Lucas for things directly sometimes made him bristle in a way I couldn't fully predict. "Recovery's going to be tough," I told him. "Dr. Kaufman says I'll need someone with me for the first 2 weeks at minimum, maybe 3. Lucas had nodded slowly, the way he did when he was already composing his response before I finished speaking. "I'll figure something out, Mom. I'll talk to Renee." Renee, his wife. A woman who had smiled at me with the corners of her mouth for 15 years while her eyes stayed perfectly, absolutely still. "Okay," I said. "Thank you." He never mentioned it again, and I never pushed. Because pushing, in our family, had always felt like the first step toward losing whatever fragile thing remained between us. I checked into the hospital the evening before the surgery. The admissions nurse, a young woman with tired eyes and efficient hands, asked me if I had someone coming in the morning. A family member. Someone to speak to the surgeon before the procedure and to be there when I came out of anesthesia. "My son," I told her. "He'll be here by 7. She typed something into her computer and didn't ask any follow-up questions, and I was grateful for that. My room was on the 3rd floor, quiet, with a window that faced the parking structure. I had brought a small overnight bag, a change of clothes, my toiletries, a paperback I knew I wouldn't read. I arranged these things in the small closet with the automatic habit of a woman who has spent a lifetime making order out of whatever space she occupies. Then I sat down on the edge of the hospital bed and called Lucas. It rang 4 times. Voicemail. Hi, sweetheart. Just letting you know I'm checked in. Room 314. Surgery's at 7, so they'll probably take me in around 6:30 for prep. I hope the drive isn't too bad in the morning. I love you. I set the phone on the nightstand and looked at it for a long moment. Then I turned out the light and lay in the dark and told myself he would come. He did not come. Not at 6:30, when the orderlies arrived to take me to the pre-op area, and I craned my neck toward the hallway looking for a familiar face. Not at 7, when Dr. Kaufman stopped by to review the procedure and asked, with a carefully neutral expression, whether my family was on their way. Not at 9, when I was still in recovery, and a different nurse checked my chart and made a note about emergency contacts. I had called him 4 times before they took me in for prep. 6 more times in the 2 hours I lay waiting. 4 more times from the recovery room on a borrowed phone because mine was in a bag with my clothes, and the volunteer who retrieved it for me was kind enough not to comment on the fact that my hands were shaking when I unlocked the screen. 14 calls total. On the 15th, he picked up. I heard the background noise first, the low murmur of what sounded like a restaurant, or maybe a bar. Music. The clink of something. Lucas's voice when he spoke was not the voice of a man who had been rushing to a parking garage or stuck in traffic or caught in any of the dozen explanations I had been composing in my head all morning. His voice was easy, relaxed, slightly impatient. Mom, what is it? The what is it? Not are you okay or how did it go or I'm so sorry I got held up. Just what is it? I was still in recovery. There was a blood pressure cuff on my arm and an IV line in the back of my hand, and the anesthetic was still metabolizing through my system, and I had just had my hip replaced, and I was alone, and my son was somewhere with music playing, and he was asking me what it was. The surgery's over, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I'm in recovery. I just wanted you to know I'm okay. A pause. Good. Good, Mom, that's great. Listen, I'm kind of in the middle of something right now, but Lucas. I stopped. I didn't know what I had been about to say. Something. Some version of where were you, or I needed you, or I called you 14 times. But the words dried up somewhere between my chest and my throat, and what came out instead was, okay, I'll call you later. Sounds good. Take care of yourself. He hung up. I set the phone on my chest and stared at the ceiling tiles and thought, with a clarity that surprised me, he is not going to help me through this recovery. He was never going to, and I don't know yet what that means, but it means something. Her name was Emily Carter, and she introduced herself that afternoon with the specific, unhurried warmth of someone who had chosen this work for reasons that had nothing to do with a paycheck. She was 34, I guessed, maybe 35. Dark hair pulled back, a small tattoo of a bird on her left wrist that she caught me looking at once and explained without any self-consciousness was a swallow. They always find their way home, she said. My grandmother had a thing about them. Emily was not my assigned nurse. She was covering for someone, and our first encounter was entirely accidental. She came in to check the IV I'd apparently been messing with in my sleep, and found me instead sitting up at 2 in the morning with my phone in my lap, rereading a text conversation with Lucas from 8 months ago. You're supposed to be resting, she said, not scolding, just noting it. I know. She adjusted the IV line with practiced efficiency, but she didn't leave. She stood there a moment, looking at me with the particular attention of someone who actually sees the person in front of them rather than the chart on the wall. Is there anything I can get you? She asked. Water? I can ask the kitchen about tea if you want something warm. No, I said. Thank you. She nodded and started toward the door. My son didn't come, I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things sometimes do at 2 in the morning, with none of the editing that daylight allows. Emily turned around. He said he'd be here. He promised. I paused. I called him 14 times. She was quiet for a moment. Then she came back to the room and sat down in the visitor's chair, not perching on the edge of it, but settling into it, like someone who had made a decision to stay. How long ago was that, she asked, that he promised? 3 weeks. And before this, is this? She seemed to choose her next words with care. Is this something that's happened before? Him not showing up? The question landed precisely on the bruise I had been trying not to press. I looked at her for a moment. This nurse I had known for approximately 20 minutes. This stranger sitting in a hospital chair at 2 in the morning, asking me the question I had been avoiding for years. More than I'd like to admit, I said finally. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell me I was sure he had a good reason, or that family was complicated, or that things would look different in the morning. She just nodded slowly, like someone receiving information and taking it seriously. You shouldn't have to go through a surgery alone, she said. Nobody should. It was such a simple thing to say, so plain, and it undid me completely, not in a sobbing, dramatic way, but in the quiet, interior way that real grief works. I felt something move through my chest like a tide going out, and I understood in that moment that I had been holding myself very tightly for a very long time. No, I agreed. They shouldn't. I spent 4 days in the hospital before Dr. Kaufman cleared me for discharge. During that time, Lucas called once, on the second afternoon, a conversation that lasted 6 minutes and covered the topics of the weather, a sports result he seemed pleased about, and whether I needed him to water my plants. My plants. What about when I come home? I asked. Recovery is going to be at least 2 weeks where I really can't manage alone. We talked about this, Lucas. A brief pause on his end, and then the particular practice tone he used when he was preparing to disappoint me while making it sound like a reasonable position. Mom, Renee and I both have a lot going on right now. The timing's just, it's not great. But you could look into those home care services, right? Medicare covers some of that stuff. I looked into it. The waiting list is 6 weeks. Well, maybe the neighbors could help out. Didn't you say the woman next door? She's visiting her daughter in Portland. There's got to be something. Lucas. My voice was quiet and deliberate. I had surgery yesterday. I have a walker I can barely maneuver. I cannot get myself in and out of the bathtub alone for at least another 10 days. I'm asking my son, for 2 weeks. The pause this time was longer. I'll see what I can do, he said. He did nothing. It was Emily who solved the problem, or rather, who connected me with the solution. On the morning of my discharge, when she came in to go through my discharge paperwork, she saw something in my face that I was trying to hide. What's the plan for getting home? She asked. Taxi. And when you get there? I hesitated. I'll manage. Emily put down the clipboard. Mrs. Holloway, you live alone. You have a 2-story house with stairs. You're 4 days post-hip replacement. I know what I am. I know you do. And I know you've probably been managing things on your own for a long time, and you're good at it. But this is different. This is your body, and it needs support right now. That's not weakness. That's just biology. I looked at her. You sound like someone who's had this conversation before. A wry smile crossed her face. I've had some version of it, yes. She picked up the clipboard again. There's a short-term home care agency that works with our discharge team. They have immediate placement available most weeks. I can make a call while you're finishing up here if you want. My son is supposed to... I know, she said, and her voice was gentle but not indulgent. But is he? The bluntness of it surprised me. And then I realized it didn't. Because Emily had been watching me for 4 days, and she was a perceptive woman, and she had already understood the situation with the accuracy that sometimes only outsiders can achieve. No, I said. I don't think he is. Then let me make the call. The home care aide was a woman named Sandra, 50-something and competent and brisk in a way I appreciated. She arrived at my house 40 minutes after I did, helped me navigate the front steps, and proceeded to take stock of my living situation with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. She rearranged the downstairs so I could sleep on the first floor. She identified the 3 places in the bathroom that needed grab bars and made calls to get them installed by the next morning. She left that first evening with a list of groceries she would bring when she returned and a phone number written on a notepad by the kitchen phone. I sat in my living room after she left and looked around at the space I had shared with my husband Robert for 31 years before his heart gave out 7 years ago. The familiar objects, the framed photographs on the mantel. Lucas's school photos mixed in with the vacation pictures and the portraits from holidays past. All those years of ordinary family life arranged like evidence of something that had felt, at the time, so solid. I found myself looking at a photo of Lucas at age 12, gap-toothed and sunburned, standing on a dock at the lake house we used to rent in August, laughing at something just off camera. He had been such a joyful child. Curious, loud. He used to come into our bedroom on Saturday mornings and launch himself between Robert and me and insist on pancakes, and Robert would groan theatrically, and I would pretend to be more annoyed than I was, and Lucas would grin that 12-year-old grin, and somehow we always ended up making pancakes. Where does a child like that go? What takes his place? I sat there for a long time, alone in my quiet house, with my operated hip throbbing at a low, steady frequency, and I tried to find the thread that connected that laughing boy on the dock to the man who had not picked up the phone for 14 calls on the morning of his mother's surgery. I couldn't find it, and I wasn't sure that night whether I wanted to. Emily called to check on me 3 days after my discharge. I was surprised. It was beyond what her job required, and I said so. I wanted to make sure Sandra worked out, she said, and I wanted to make sure you were okay. Physically, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, slowly. And the other kind of okay? I paused. Outside my living room window, a pair of birds were working on something in the oak tree at the edge of the yard, building something or taking something apart. I watched them for a moment. I'm figuring some things out, I said. That sounds like a lot of work. It is. She was quiet a moment, then, can I come by sometime? I have a Saturday afternoon free next week. I could bring lunch. I thought about saying no, about maintaining the appropriate professional distance, about not becoming one of those lonely elderly women who latches onto anyone who shows her ordinary decency. I was aware of that risk. I had spent years watching other women my age fall into that particular trap, measuring their worth by whoever was willing to sit with them. But this was different. Emily wasn't sitting with me out of pity. I could hear in her voice the specific quality of a person who meant what they said. I'd like that, I told her. Fun. She came the following Saturday with soup from a deli downtown and sourdough bread from a bakery 2 blocks from the hospital. We ate at my kitchen table and talked for 3 hours. About Robert, whom I hadn't talked about with anyone in longer than I could remember. About Emily's grandmother, who had raised her after her parents separated when she was 6. About the way hospitals have a smell that never fully leaves you, no matter how many years you spend working in one. About small things and large ones, in the way that conversation sometimes moves when 2 people are both, without announcing it, deciding to trust each other. At some point, I told her about the moment in recovery, the 15th call, the background music. What is it, Mom? Emily listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her spoon and looked at me directly, with the clear gaze of someone who doesn't look away from difficult things. What are you going to do? She asked. I don't know yet, I said honestly, but I think, for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to actually ask myself that question. Instead of just hoping things will change. That's different. Yes, I said, it is. Outside, the afternoon light was moving across the kitchen floor in the particular golden way it did in March, slow and slanted, the kind that makes everything look like it's being seen for the last time or the first. I thought about Lucas's photograph on the mantel, about the boy on the dock, about the man who had asked me, what is it, while music played somewhere behind him. I thought about what it meant to spend 45 years loving someone who had, at some point I could not precisely identify, stopped loving you back. And I thought about the strange, fragile, unexpected thing that had walked into my hospital room in the form of a nurse named Emily Carter, someone I had not known 3 weeks ago, someone the universe had placed beside me not because of blood or history or obligation, but for no reason I could name, and who had sat down in the visitor's chair and stayed. I didn't have answers yet. I didn't know what was coming or how bad it would get before I understood the full shape of what my son had been planning. But I was beginning to understand something that I should have grasped years before, that the people who show up are not always the ones who are supposed to, and the ones who are supposed to sometimes never come at all. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Lucas. I let it ring 4 times, watching Emily watch me. Not with judgment, just with attention. On the 5th ring, I picked it up. "Mom," he said, and his voice had that particular quality it got when he wanted something. I recognized it now with a precision I hadn't possessed 3 weeks ago. Something had shifted in me, and the shift had altered the frequency on which I received him. "Lucas," I said. "What is it?" A pause. He didn't catch it. He never did. "Listen, Renee and I were thinking we should have dinner, the 3 of us. Catch up properly. There are some things we want to talk to you about." I looked at Emily across the table. She raised an eyebrow, a small, quiet question. "Of course," I said. "Tell me when." After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. "Dinner," Emily said, "with him and Renee. Are you going to go?" I thought about it, about what my life had been, a long series of accommodations to people who never met me halfway, about what it might be if I started paying attention, about the fact that Lucas had called me, unprompted, to invite me to dinner, and that something about the timing and the phrasing and the particular smoothness in his voice had landed in my chest not as warmth, but as warning. "Yes," I said, "I'm going to go. I think it's time I started watching more carefully." Emily nodded slowly. "And I'll be here when you get back." It was such a plain thing to say, the simplest promise in the world. But after the morning of March 14th, after 14 unanswered calls and a man who asked his mother, "What is it?" while music played behind him, simple and plain and kept, was the most extraordinary thing I could imagine. "Thank you," I said, "for all of it." She shook her head. "I didn't do anything." "You sat down," I said. "At 2 a.m, in that chair. You sat down and stayed." She looked at me across the kitchen table, the afternoon light falling between us, and she didn't argue, because she knew, the way some people just know, that sometimes the smallest act, just sitting down, just staying, is everything. The dinner was set for a Thursday. Lucas had chosen the restaurant himself, a place called Meridian, upscale in the way that places are when they want you to feel the cost of being there before you even open the menu. White tablecloths, candles and glass votives, the kind of quiet that money buys. When he'd texted me the name, I'd had to look it up online, and the prices I saw made me pause. Lucas had never been the type to spend money on his mother's comfort, but he was, I was beginning to understand, the type to spend money on atmosphere, on the construction of a particular mood, on making sure the setting was soft enough that what happened inside it would feel reasonable. Sandra drove me. My hip was still managing its slow negotiation with the walker, and the idea of navigating a restaurant parking lot alone in the dark was not one I was willing to entertain. Sandra waited in the car with a book and her phone and a thermos of coffee, and I walked through the glass doors of Meridian and found Lucas and Renee already seated. They had taken the corner booth. Of course they had. Lucas stood when he saw me, which surprised me. It had been some time since he'd bothered with that particular gesture. He looked good. He always looked good, had inherited Robert's height and his square jaw, and had spent his adult years cultivating the kind of groomed confidence that photographs well. He was 53 now, though he could pass for a younger man in the right light. He kissed my cheek and took my coat and held my elbow as I settled into the booth, and all of it was so smooth, so practiced, that something cold and quiet moved through me. Renee was already smiling. She had been smiling, I suspected, since before I walked in. "Margaret," she said, "you look wonderful. You really do. Considering, that one word dropped so casually, so precisely calibrated to remind me of my age and my surgery and the general precariousness of my position without technically saying any of those things. 20 years of Renee, and she had never lost that particular skill. "Thank you, Renee," I said. "You look well, too." We ordered drinks. Lucas made a production of the wine list, consulting with the server in the way men do when they want to signal that they know things. I ordered water. My medication made alcohol a poor idea, and besides, I wanted to be clear-headed. I had the feeling, the quiet, persistent, animal feeling that I had learned over 72 years to respect, that I was going to need every bit of clarity I possessed. The conversation for the first hour was, on the surface, ordinary. Lucas asked about my recovery in the solicitous tones of a man who had definitely not been absent for all of it. He asked about Sandra, whom he referred to as the aide, as though she were a household appliance. He asked whether I was sleeping, whether the pain was manageable, whether I'd had a follow-up with Dr. Kaufman. And I answered each question with the pleasant brevity of a woman who has learned not to say everything she's thinking in public. Renee talked about their house, some renovation they were doing to the kitchen, countertops or cabinets or both, I lost track, and about a trip they'd been planning to somewhere warm. She mentioned prices, casually, the way people do when money is supposedly not a concern, and they want you to know it. But something in the way she mentioned them struck a minor chord of wrongness that I couldn't immediately name. The food came. We ate. And somewhere between the entrees and the moment the server came around with the dessert menu, Lucas put down his fork and looked at me with an expression I recognized too late. It was the expression of a man who has reached the part of the evening he actually came for. "Mom," he said, "there's something Renee and I have been wanting to talk to you about. Something important." "All right," I said. Renee folded her hands on the table. She had stopped smiling, which was somehow worse than when she was. "We've been thinking," Lucas said, "about your situation, your long-term situation, with the house, with your finances, with, everything." "My situation seems fairly clear to me," I said. "Mom." His voice took on the particular patient, slightly strained quality it got when he thought I was being difficult. "You just had a major surgery. You're living alone in a house that's too big for you, with stairs, and you're 72. Things are only going to get more complicated. You need someone managing things properly." "I have an accountant," I said, "and an attorney. Things are being managed properly." "That's not—" He paused, recalibrated. "What we're talking about is something more formal, more protective. A power of attorney arrangement, so that if something happens to you, if there's another emergency, someone who loves you can step in and handle things without any delays or complications." There it was. Power of attorney. Said with the word loves positioned right beside it, like a hand on your shoulder guiding you somewhere you haven't agreed to go. I looked at my son across the white tablecloth and the candle in its glass votive, and I thought, there it is. Not with anger, not yet. With something closer to the sick, steady recognition of a thing you feared might be true, turning out to be exactly true. "That's quite a conversation to have over dinner," I said. "We thought it would be easier," Renee said, smooth as water over stone, "in a relaxed setting, less formal than an office." "Less formal," I repeated. "Mom, we love you." Lucas leaned forward slightly. "This is about protecting you. You were alone for your surgery. You were alone coming home. We worry about you. What if something else happens and we can't reach the right people fast enough? If I had power of attorney, I could step in immediately, make decisions, handle things." Handle things. Two words that should have meant care and meant nothing of the kind. "I understand what power of attorney is, Lucas," I said. My voice was steady. I was working to keep it that way. "What specifically would you want authority over?" He hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. "Everything that matters," Renee said, stepping in with the ease of a woman who had rehearsed this. "Financial decisions, the house, medical decisions, obviously, just everything so that if there's ever an emergency, we can move quickly." "The house," I said. "And the finances." "Yes. Everything." Lucas reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His hand was warm. It should have felt like comfort. It did not feel like comfort. "You trust us, don't you, Mom?" I looked at my son's hand covering mine and thought about 14 phone calls. I thought about what is it, Mom and background music and the word considering and countertops and a trip somewhere warm. I thought about Emily sitting in a hospital visitor's chair at 2 in the morning because she had chosen to stay. And I thought about my son, my flesh and blood, who had promised to be there and had not come. "Of course I do," I said. I said it the way you say things when you are buying yourself time. I did not tell Emily about the dinner that night. I sat with it alone for 2 days, turning it over in the way you turn something fragile over, looking for the crack. On the third day, Sandra found me at the kitchen table with a folder of old bank statements I'd pulled from the filing cabinet in Robert's old study, and she gave me a look I wasn't supposed to see. A quick, flickering look of concern that told me I had been sitting there longer than I realized. "You need anything?" she asked. "No," I said. "Thank you." She nodded and left me to it, and I sat there with those bank statements and tried to remember the last time I had actually read them. The honest answer was not recently enough. Robert had always handled the finances, not because I couldn't, but because he was the one who'd enjoyed it, who'd found a kind of pleasure in the management of numbers that I'd never shared. After he died, I had handed most of that responsibility to our accountant, a careful older man named Warren Gish, and trusted that the mechanisms Robert had put in place would continue to function. I had not asked too many questions. I realized now how much that cost me. What I found in those bank statements was not fraud, not anything obviously wrong, but there were patterns I didn't recognize. Small, incremental transfers to an account number I couldn't identify, moving through the months like a slow leak. Nothing large enough to alarm, individually. But they added up, and they were consistent, and they all post-dated Robert's death by about 8 months. I put the statements back in the folder and sat very still. Then I picked up my phone and called Emily. She came that evening. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten soup and sourdough and talked about swallows and grandmothers, and she listened while I told her about the dinner. All of it, the restaurant, the corner booth, the wine list, the considering, the moment Lucas had said everything and reached across the table and put his hand over mine. When I finished, Emily was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" she asked. "When he asked if you trusted him?" I said yes. "Did you mean it?" "No." She absorbed this. "Okay, what are you going to do?" I pushed the folder across the table. She opened it, and I watched her face as she looked through the statements. She wasn't a financial expert. She'd be the first to say so. But she was a woman of uncommon perceptiveness, and she saw what I saw. "These transfers," she said. "Yes." "Do you know what account they're going to?" "Not yet." "You need to talk to your attorney." "I know." "Not your accountant first, your attorney." I looked at her. "Why the distinction?" "Because," she said carefully, "if there's something deliberately wrong here, the last thing you want is to tip off the wrong person before you understand the full picture. An attorney has privilege. An accountant doesn't work the same way." She paused. "My aunt went through something like this. Not the same, but similar enough. The mistake she made was talking to the wrong person first and giving everyone time to rearrange things before anyone looked." I hadn't known about the aunt. In the weeks of conversation Emily and I had accumulated, she had mentioned her grandmother often, her parents occasionally, but not this. "What happened to your aunt?" I asked. Emily's expression shifted into something complicated. She lost about $60,000 before anyone put the pieces together, and the person who'd been moving money was someone she'd trusted completely. She met my eyes. Family. The word landed between us like a stone dropping into still water. "I'll call Daniel Mercer," I said. Daniel had been Robert's attorney for decades, a deliberate, thorough man I had met a handful of times at holiday gatherings and never had occasion to call professionally. Robert always said he was the best person to have in your corner when things got complicated. "Call him tomorrow," Emily said. "Not next week. Tomorrow." I called Daniel Mercer's office the next morning at 9. His assistant put me through within 20 minutes, which surprised me. I had expected to be managed into an appointment weeks out. Instead, Daniel himself came on the line, and the first thing he said, after the initial condolences about Robert that he would always offer when we spoke, was, "Margaret, what's happened?" I told him about the dinner, about the power of attorney request, about the bank statements. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Margaret," he said, "I need you to do something for me before we go any further. I need you to not sign anything, not a document, not a letter, not even something that looks informal. until we've spoken in person. Can you do that? Yes, I said. Good. I have a cancellation Thursday afternoon. Can you come in? I'll be there. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Outside, a car pulled slowly down the street. An ordinary thing, a neighbor coming home from somewhere. But I watched it until it disappeared, and something in the back of my mind had begun quietly to count backward. Counting back through the months since Robert's death. Counting back through Lucas's visits, which had become slightly more frequent in the past year, I realized. Slightly more attentive. Phone calls that asked how I was feeling, how the house was holding up, whether I'd thought about the future. I had experienced those calls as love, or something close enough to it that I hadn't examined the difference. Now I was examining it. Sandra drove me to Daniel's office Thursday afternoon. His firm occupied the fourth floor of a building on Ellsworth Street, quiet and deliberately unglamorous in the way of people who have been successful long enough not to need to advertise it. Daniel met me in the lobby himself, a small gesture that I recognized as consideration given my walker, and walked with me to his office at a pace that matched mine without making anything of it. He was 70 himself, or close to it, heavy-set, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had spent decades listening carefully to people in difficult situations and had settled into a permanent expression of attentive calm. He got me seated, sent his assistant for water, and then folded his hands on his desk and looked at me the way he always had, like someone who understood that what I was about to tell him mattered. I told him everything, not just the dinner and the bank statements, but the surgery, the 14 calls, the "what is it, Mom?" The way Lucas's visits had picked up in the past year, the renovation and the trip somewhere warm and the price of things mentioned too casually. I told him about Emily because Emily had become part of the story now, and I didn't want to edit her out. I told him all of it, in the steady, careful voice of a woman who has been holding a heavy thing for long enough that setting it down is both a relief and a kind of grief. Daniel listened without interrupting. He made occasional notes in a legal pad, brief and precise. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You said Robert set up the estate structure before he passed," he said. "Did he ever walk you through the details of the trust?" "Not completely," I admitted. "He said it was taken care of. I trusted him. The trust document should be in your files at home. When you get back, I want you to find it and bring it to me, or have Sandra scan it and send it over. Don't discuss it with Lucas before you do." "All right. And the bank statements you mentioned, those transfers, can you get me 3 years' worth?" "I think so. Warren Gish has all of that. Call Warren and ask him to pull everything and send it directly to my office. Don't ask him why, just say I need it for an estate review." "Is Warren—" I stopped. I had started to ask whether Warren was trustworthy, and then I heard myself asking it and felt the weight of a world where I was no longer certain who was. Daniel seemed to understand. "Warren Gish is a good man," he said carefully. "But let's be thorough. Better to know what we're looking at before we involve anyone else." I nodded. My hands were folded in my lap, and I noticed they were completely still. Not because I was calm, but because something beyond calm had taken over. Something that felt like a decision that had already been made at a level deeper than thought. "Daniel," I said, "how bad could this be?" He looked at me steadily. "I don't know yet. But Margaret, the fact that Lucas asked for power of attorney over both your finances and your property, at this particular moment, in this particular way," he paused. "It's important that we understand the full picture before you respond to him at all. Whatever he asks you, whatever pressure he applies between now and when I've had a chance to review the documents, I want you to smile and say you'll think about it. Just stall him. For now. Yes." I almost smiled. "I've spent 45 years managing Lucas's expectations, Daniel. I think I can stall him for 2 weeks." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Not quite surprise, but a kind of recalibration, a small adjustment in how he was reading me. "You're not what I expected," he said, "after Robert described you." "What did Robert say?" "He said you were the most patient woman he'd ever known." A pause. "I think maybe he meant something slightly different than patient." "He meant I was good at waiting," I said, "at absorbing things, at keeping the peace." I straightened in my chair. I'm not interested in keeping peace anymore, Daniel. I'm interested in the truth. He held my gaze for a moment, and something in his expression settled into what I can only describe as respect. Then let's find it, he said. The trust document was in the third drawer of Robert's old filing cabinet, in a manila envelope with the name of Daniel's firm stamped on the outside. I brought it out to the kitchen table that evening and sat with it for a long time before opening it. The paper inside was dense and formal, the language of careful legal construction, the architecture of a life's intentions laid out in numbered clauses and subsections. I was not fluent in this language, but I read it slowly, twice, and certain things emerged from the formality like shapes in fog. Robert had built more protection into this structure than I had known, more deliberate, more specific protection, against exactly the kinds of pressures that were now being applied. He had known something, or feared something, or simply loved me well enough to build walls around what he was leaving me. I sat in the kitchen with the trust document spread across the table and thought about my husband, about the 31 years of ordinary mornings and difficult conversations, and the particular way he had of reaching over in the dark to put his hand on my shoulder when he thought I was asleep and something was worrying him. About the fact that he had sat with an attorney and built careful, deliberate protections around my future. Protections I had not known I had because I had trusted that they were there without examining them. He had known. I wasn't sure what he'd known exactly, but he had looked at his son and then looked at his wife and built walls, and I had not seen them until now, and now I was sitting here with the knowledge of them pressing against my chest like something between grief and gratitude. My phone buzzed. A text from Lucas. Hey, Mom, just checking in. Have you given more thought to what we discussed? No rush, just want to make sure we're taking care of things for you. No rush, just want to make sure. I set the phone face down on the table. I gathered the trust document carefully, returned it to its envelope, and set it in the bag Sandra would take to Daniel's office in the morning. Then I sat alone in my kitchen and understood, with a clarity so complete it was almost peaceful, that my son had been planning this for some time. That his sudden attentiveness over the past year, the more frequent calls, the concern about my health, the dinner at Meridian, none of it had been love. All of it had been preparation. And the man who had not come to his mother's surgery, who had let the phone ring 14 times and then asked, "What is it?" over the sound of music playing, had not stayed away because he was busy or careless or simply a bad son. He had stayed away because in his mind, the transaction was already in motion, and he had simply been waiting for it to complete. Daniel called me on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Sandra had delivered the envelope to his office. I was at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee when my phone rang, and something in the quality of his voice when he said my name, measured, careful, the voice of a man assembling his words before he releases them, told me that what he had found was not small. Can you come in today? He asked. This afternoon, if possible. How bad is it? A pause. I'd rather show you in person, Margaret. There's quite a bit to go through. Sandra drove me at 2 o'clock. I spent the ride watching the city move past the car window and thinking about Robert, about the trust document, about the walls he had built that I hadn't known were there. I had been thinking about him constantly in these past 11 days, in a way I hadn't since the first raw year after his death, not with the diffuse ache of general grief, but with a specific, focused attention, as though I were trying to read something he had written me in a language I was only now learning. Daniel met me in the lobby again. He shook my hand with both of his, a gesture so deliberate that I understood immediately this was going to be one of the most difficult conversations of my adult life. His office felt different that afternoon. The same room, the same heavy furniture, and the same framed degrees on the wall, but the light was different, or perhaps I was. He had documents arranged on his desk in a way that told me he had been preparing for this meeting with some care, organized into sections, a yellow legal pad with notes in his precise handwriting set to one side. Sit down, Margaret, he said. Not unkindly. I sat. I want to start with the trust, he said, because that's the foundation of everything else, and it's important you understand what Robert built before we talk about what Lucas has been doing. He opened the first section of documents. Robert established this trust 17 years ago, and he updated it 4 times since. The last update was 14 months before he died. That final update is significant. What did he change? He added what's called a spendthrift provision. It's a specific clause that prevents any beneficiary from assigning their interest in the trust to a creditor or from transferring it in advance of actually receiving it. In plain language, it means Lucas cannot borrow against, sell, or pledge any future inheritance. He cannot use what he expects to receive as collateral, not legally, not while you're alive and the trust is structured as it is. I looked at him. Robert added that 14 months before he died. Yes. Which means he knew or suspected that Lucas might try to use a future inheritance as leverage. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. That would be a reasonable inference. I sat with that for a moment. Robert, in his last year, quietly protecting me from something he hadn't wanted to name out loud. The image of it, my husband sitting in this very office, asking for that specific provision, choosing not to tell me why, was almost more than I could hold. What else? I said. Daniel turned to the next section. The bank statements Warren sent over. Those transfers you identified, I had a forensic accountant look at them. They trace to a holding account that was opened in Lucas's name 22 months ago. The amounts are consistent and deliberate, small enough to avoid automatic scrutiny, large enough to accumulate meaningfully over time. Over the 22 months, the total transferred out of your personal operating account is $67,000. The number landed in the room like something physical. 67,000, I repeated. Yes. How? I never authorized. You had a joint signatory arrangement on that account from years ago, Daniel said. From a period when Robert was ill and you needed Lucas to be able to handle certain routine payments. That arrangement was never formally revoked. I closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then I opened them. I forgot about that. Most people would have. It was established during a crisis and it became invisible afterward. Lucas used it. Daniel's voice remained level, but there was something underneath the levelness. A controlled professional anger, the kind that experienced attorneys develop when they've seen this particular species of betrayal before. He was careful, nothing large, nothing that would trigger an alert from Warren or from you, but consistent, month after month. For almost 2 years, I said. Yes. I looked down at my hands in my lap. They were still. I noticed that about myself, how still I had become in moments of extreme emotion, as though some deeper part of me understood that movement would cost me something I couldn't afford to spend. Daniel, I said, tell me about Lucas's finances, his actual finances. He held my gaze. That's the other part of what I need to show you. What Daniel laid out over the next 40 minutes was a picture assembled from public records, credit inquiries. Lucas had consented to without knowing the consent trail was visible to an experienced attorney, and a set of court documents that were, in Daniel's word, illuminating. Lucas had made a series of investment decisions over the past 4 years that had gone badly wrong, not merely poorly, catastrophically. He had put significant capital into 2 commercial real estate ventures that had collapsed during a market correction. He had personally guaranteed loans for a business partnership that had dissolved in litigation, leaving him exposed. He had refinanced his home twice to cover mounting losses and had a 3rd mortgage on a property whose value had dropped below what was owed on it. His debt load, as Daniel walked me through it, was staggering. By the most conservative estimate, Lucas owed creditors somewhere in excess of $2.5 million. $2.5 million. And his assets, once you stripped away what was leveraged and what was encumbered, amounted to a fraction of that. He's functionally insolvent, Daniel said, in the sense that his liabilities vastly exceed his accessible assets. He hasn't filed for bankruptcy, and I suspect he's been managing to keep things from collapsing by the $67,000 in part, and by whatever he expected to access through the power of attorney arrangement. I thought about the dinner at Meridian, the wine list, the renovation and the trip somewhere warm, mentioned with that particular casualness. Had any of that been real? Or had it been set dressing, a performance of prosperity intended to reassure me that my son was fine, doing well, no need to worry, just a simple matter of paperwork to protect his mother? The renovation, I said, and the trip they mentioned. I couldn't speak to the specifics. I think they may have been fiction, something to make me think he didn't need anything. I paused. He needed everything. Daniel was quiet. My estate, I said. What is it actually worth? He turned to the last section. This is what I want you to understand, Margaret, because I don't think you've had a complete picture. Robert was a more sophisticated financial manager than he perhaps let on, even to you. The trust assets, combined with the investment portfolio, the property holdings, and the life insurance structures he put in place, as of last quarter's valuation, you are looking at an estate in the range of $14 million. The number was so far outside what I had been carrying in my head that I simply repeated it. 14 million. Yes. I stopped. I knew we were comfortable. I knew Robert had been careful. I didn't know. He was more than careful, Daniel said. He was exceptional. The structures he built over 30 years of deliberate, patient work. Margaret, you are a wealthy woman. Significantly wealthy. And you have been, for some time, without fully knowing it. I sat in that office chair and felt the ground shift underneath the version of reality I had been living in. $14 million. And Lucas. Lucas, who had not answered 14 phone calls. Lucas, who had asked me, what is it, while music played. Lucas, who had sat across a white tablecloth and put his warm hand over mine and asked if I trusted him. Lucas had known. Lucas had known exactly what the estate was worth, probably better than I and had been watching it the way a man watches something he intends to take. He needed my money, I said. Not a question. Just the sentence, said aloud, so it could be real. He needed your money, Daniel confirmed, and the power of attorney he asked for would have given him access to move assets, restructure accounts, potentially leverage the property, before I understood what was happening. Before anyone could stop him, yes. I pressed my fingertips together in my lap. Outside Daniel's window, the afternoon was moving along at its ordinary pace. Traffic, a bus stopping at the corner, the unremarkable mechanics of a city going about its business. All of it indifferent to the fact that inside this office, the last 45 years of my life were being reread with a new key, and nothing meant what I had thought it meant. Daniel, I said, is what he's done, the transfers from my account, is that criminal? He considered his words. What he did exploits a legal authorization that technically existed. Whether a prosecutor would characterize it as theft or as misuse of a financial relationship, that's a nuanced question, and it would depend on a number of factors. What I can tell you is that civilly, you have a strong case for recovery of those funds. And what I'd recommend before we make any decisions about legal action is that we focus first on making sure no further transfers are possible and that the estate is fully secured. How quickly can that happen? I can file to formally revoke his signatory authority by end of this week. And there are additional protections we can put in place through the trust structure. My phone buzzed on the desk between us. We both looked at it. Lucas. I looked at Daniel. He gave me a small, precise nod. I let it go to voicemail. He called again that evening. Then Renee called from her number, which she almost never did. A tactical shift that told me they had conferred and decided to try a different angle. I listened to Renee's voicemail twice. Her voice was warm in the practiced way it always was, but there was something underneath the warmth that hadn't been there before. A slight tension, a fraction of urgency, carefully managed but not quite concealed. Margaret, it's Renee. I just wanted to reach out personally. Woman to woman, because I feel like we got off on the wrong foot at dinner, and I want you to know that everything Lucas said came from a place of genuine love. We just worry about you being alone. We want to make sure you're protected. Give me a call when you get a chance. Woman to woman. I set the phone down and went to the window and stood there in the dark for a while. The thing about Renee was that she was not stupid. She was, in fact, quite intelligent. A quality I had always recognized and always found in her somehow more troubling than incompetence would have been. Because an intelligent person doing something cruel does it with more efficiency and more plausible deniability than a foolish one. Every smile perfectly calibrated, every word chosen to leave no fingerprints. Woman to woman. as though the two of us had some separate, intimate understanding that existed apart from the disaster her husband had been building. I thought about calling Emily, but it was late, and I found I needed to sit with this alone for a little while longer before I could speak about it. Needed the specific, private space of my own house and my own silence to absorb what Daniel had shown me. $14 million, 67,000 already gone. A son who had watched me go into surgery alone and had not come because, in his mind, the important transaction was not his mother's health. It was the estate. I stood at the window and I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not just the betrayal, which was enormous. Not just the fear, which was there. But the grief. The specific, terrible grief of a mother who has finally stopped arguing with the evidence and let herself understand that the child she loved is not the person she thought. That the love she spent decades tending had been received as a resource to be managed, not a gift to be cherished. That somewhere along the way, gradually, in the particular slow way that moral collapse happens, her son had become someone who looked at his mother and saw a balance sheet. That grief was not loud. It didn't announce itself. It settled into my chest like cold water and sat there. I stayed at the window until the street below was completely empty, and then I went to bed. Sandra noticed the next morning that something had shifted in me. She was perceptive in the quiet, unobtrusive way of people who spend their working lives in close proximity to others' pain. She didn't ask directly. She brought my coffee and my medication and made a point of moving through the morning tasks with a lightness that I understood was her version of giving me space. And I was grateful for it in the way you're grateful for small, ordinary kindnesses when the large, extraordinary things have been stripped away. Emily came by that afternoon. I told her everything. The 67,000, the $2.5 million in debt, the $14 million in the estate, the spendthrift provision Robert had added 14 months before he died. I told her about Renee's voicemail. I told her about standing at the window in the dark. She listened the way she always listened, with her whole attention, not interrupting, not filling the silences with reassurance that would have felt hollow and wrong. When I finished, she said, "How are you doing? Not the legal part. You." "I'm angry," I said, which is actually better than I expected to feel. I thought it would be worse than anger. "What did you think it would be?" I considered. "I thought it would break something I couldn't put back together." I looked at her. "But it hasn't. I don't know if that makes me stronger than I thought I was, or just older, more practiced at absorbing things." "Maybe both," she said. "Robert knew," I told her. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. He built that provision into the trust because he knew, or feared, that Lucas would eventually—" I stopped. "He protected me without telling me. I don't know whether to be grateful or heartbroken about that." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Maybe you can be both." "Yes," I said. "I think I am." We sat with that for a moment, and then Emily set down her coffee cup and looked at me with the direct gaze that I had come to rely on more than I would have predicted, back in those early days when she was just a nurse who had sat down in a hospital chair. "What happens next?" she asked. "Daniel files the paperwork to remove Lucas's signatory authority. We secure the accounts. And then—" I paused. "And then I have to decide what I want to do with what's left. With Lucas. With the estate. With all of it. That's a lot to decide." "It is." I looked at my hands. "He's going to push back when he realizes the access is gone," Daniel warned me. "How do you think he'll push?" I had been thinking about this, turning it over in the days since Daniel's office, examining it from angles I didn't enjoy. He'll try to make a case that I'm not capable of managing my own affairs, that I'm too old, too confused, too something. He'll frame it as concern. He'll find a way to suggest that my decisions aren't really my decisions. Emily's expression shifted. Competency. Yes, it's the next logical move if you're someone who's decided that what his mother has is rightfully his and just needs to be transferred correctly. I said it flatly, without drama, because it was simply the truth. He'd try to have me declared incompetent, put under a guardianship, his guardianship. The word sat between us in the afternoon light of my kitchen, ugly and precise. "Can he do that?" Emily asked. "He can try," I said. "People do. It's not as difficult as it should be if you have the right physicians and the right paperwork and a family member willing to make the argument." I paused. "But Daniel says the trust structure, combined with my own documented mental acuity and the evidence of what Lucas has been doing, the case would be very hard to make successfully. It would fail, but it would be painful. And public. And public." Emily looked at me steadily. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the boy in the photograph on the mantle, the 12-year-old on the dock. I had spent so many years carrying that boy in my chest like a talisman, like the proof that something real had existed, that the love I'd given had landed somewhere, mattered to someone. I had used that boy to excuse the man, to explain away the absences and the cold silences and the "what is it, Mom?" and all the rest of it. I had held on to that boy because letting go of him meant letting go of the story I had told myself about my own life. But he was 53 now, and he had been moving money out of my account for 22 months, and he had let me call him 14 times on the morning of my surgery and had not picked up once. "Yes," I said, "I'm prepared." That evening, Lucas left a third voicemail. His voice this time had shed the practiced warmth and was doing something different, something that tried to sound hurt, wounded, a son who could not understand why his mother was not returning his calls. "Mom, I don't know what's going on, but I'm getting a little worried. You're not responding, and I need to know you're okay. Can you just let me know you're okay?" I need to know you're okay. I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about all the times I had needed him to know I was okay. All the times the phone had rung in empty air. I thought about the morning of March 14th. I thought about the ventilation system humming in the hospital walls. Then I put the phone down, picked up Daniel's number, and sent a text that said simply, "He's starting to escalate. I'm ready to move forward." Daniel's response came back in under 2 minutes. "Filing first thing tomorrow morning." I set the phone on the nightstand. I turned out the light. In the dark, I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling and understood that whatever came next was going to be hard and messy and nothing like the clean resolution I might have wished for. Lucas was not going to accept this gracefully. Renee was not going to disappear. The fight I had spent my whole life trying to avoid was about to arrive anyway, on its own schedule, wearing whatever face it chose. But Robert had built walls. Daniel was holding the line. Emily was sitting down and staying. And I, the woman who had answered the phone on the 15th call and said, "Okay, I'll call you later," was finally, at 72 years old, done absorbing things that should have been refused years ago. I closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I slept. The paperwork Daniel filed on that Thursday morning moved through the system with the quiet efficiency of legal machinery that has been properly prepared. By Friday afternoon, Lucas's signatory authority on my personal operating account had been formally revoked. By the following Monday, Daniel had notified the relevant financial institutions of the trust protective provisions and ensured that no further transfers could originate without my direct, witnessed authorization. I did not tell Lucas any of this was happening. He found out on a Wednesday, when he apparently attempted something. Daniel was deliberately vague about the specifics, in the careful way of attorneys who understand that their clients sometimes sleep better with less detail, and was denied. Whatever he tried, it failed. And that failure was the match that lit what came next. He called me 6 times that Wednesday afternoon. I watched the phone vibrate across my kitchen table with each call, the screen lighting up with his name, and I did not pick up. Not out of fear, not out of avoidance, but because Daniel had advised me with considerable emphasis that any conversation with Lucas at this stage should be brief, non-committal, and preferably witnessed or recorded. I was not yet ready for the conversation that was actually required, and I knew, the way you know things at 72 when you have finally stopped lying to yourself, that picking up that phone in that moment would not have produced anything useful. The 7th call, I answered. "Mom." His voice was different. The smoothness was gone. What was underneath it was something rawer and less managed. Not grief exactly, but the specific agitation of a man whose plan has encountered an unexpected obstacle. "What did you do?" Hello, Lucas, I said. What did you do to the account? I tried to. There was an issue, and the bank said there's been some kind of legal. I spoke with Daniel Mercer, I said. He's been helping me review my financial arrangements. Robert's trust needed some updating. A silence. Not a short one. Daniel Mercer, he repeated. You went to Dad's attorney. He's my attorney, too. Mom. The agitation was sharpening into something else now, something with more edge. Why didn't you talk to me before you did anything? We had a conversation. Renee and I came to dinner specifically to discuss. I know what you came to dinner to discuss, I said. My voice came out very steady. Steadier than I felt, which was something I had learned to do over a lifetime of keeping peace. The difference now was that I was choosing when to deploy it rather than defaulting to it out of habit. I've been reviewing my situation carefully, and I've made some decisions about how I want things structured going forward. What decisions? Mom, you should have talked to me. Lucas. I stopped him. Just his name, said quietly. I'm your mother. Not the other way around. My financial affairs are mine to manage. The silence that followed was a different quality than the one before it. This one had weight. He was recalculating behind it. I could almost feel it, the specific gears turning in a mind adjusting to a situation that had not gone according to the plan. I'm coming over, he said. I'd rather you didn't. Not today. Mom! I'll call you when I'm ready to talk, I said. Goodbye, Lucas. I hung up. My hands, I noticed, were not shaking. I sat at the table for a long moment. Then I called Emily. She came that evening with takeout containers and the specific unhurried quality she had of arriving in a space and making it feel less empty. We ate at the kitchen table, and I told her about the call, about Lucas's voice without its smoothness, about the recalculating silence, about hanging up. How did it feel? She asked. Terrible, I said, and necessary, both at the same time. That's usually how the right thing feels. I keep thinking about what comes next, I said. He's not going to stop. Daniel warned me. Once the financial access is closed off, the competency argument becomes more likely. Lucas is going to need to find another way in, and that's the way that's left. Emily was quiet for a moment. Has Daniel said anything about the money he already took, the $67,000? He says I have options. Civil recovery is possible. Whether I pursue it depends on what I decide I want the outcome to be. I set down my fork. And that's the thing I've been sitting with. What do I actually want? Not what's legally available to me. What do I want? What do you want? Emily asked. Simply, directly, the way she always asked things. I had been thinking about this for days, turning it over at night when sleep came slowly, turning it over in the mornings while Sandra moved through the kitchen routines and the house settled into its ordinary sounds. What did I want? Not what a good mother would want, not what a forgiving person would want, not what would make the situation neat or resolved or comfortable for everyone involved. What did I want? I want my life back, I said. The version of it that isn't organized around managing Lucas's expectations and absorbing his failures. I want to stop being someone's inheritance. I paused. And I want to do something real with what Robert built, something that matters beyond just sitting here waiting for things to get worse. Emily looked at me with the expression she got when something had landed precisely where she was listening. What kind of something? She asked. And that was the question. That was the one that had been forming under the surface of everything else for weeks now. Forming the way things form at depth, slowly, under pressure, until the shape is complete enough to be named. When I was in that hospital, I said, the morning of my surgery, do you know what I thought about, lying on that gurney alone? I thought about whether this was what it was like for everyone. Older people going into operating rooms with nobody there, coming home to empty houses, needing help and having nowhere to ask. I looked at her, and I thought about how wrong that was. How wrong it is that people reach the end of their lives having given everything to their families and their work, and whatever they believed in, and then they need something. They need someone to be there. And there's nothing. Emily's face had gone very still in the way it did when she was listening at full depth. I have $14 million, I said. The number still felt strange in my mouth. And I have time. Not unlimited time. I'm 72 and my hip is still arguing with me most mornings, but I have time. And I have been sitting inside a story about my life where Lucas and his needs and his failures were the central plot. And I am done with that story. I paused. I want to build something. Something for people like I was. Older people abandoned during illness and recovery. People who need someone to sit in the chair. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then very carefully she said, "The chair." 2 a.m, I said. "In that hospital room. You sat down and you stayed. Do you understand what that meant to me? What it still means?" She didn't look away. "I just did my job." "No," I said. "You did more than that. You chose to. And most people don't have anyone who chooses." I held her gaze. I want to fund something that makes that choice possible. For people who have no one to make it. I told Daniel about it 3 days later. He listened with the same careful attention he gave everything, and when I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. "A foundation," he said, "the Holloway Hope Foundation, named for Robert as much as for me. This is his work that makes it possible." I paused. "I want it focused specifically on elderly individuals who are isolated during medical events, hospital companions, home recovery support, the gaps that fall between what insurance covers and what family is supposed to provide but often doesn't. The funding? I'm prepared to endow it significantly. Not everything. I'm not sentimental to the point of foolishness, but enough to make it real. Enough to sustain it without depending on annual fundraising to survive." Daniel made a note. "And Emily Carter, you mentioned wanting her involved. I want her to help lead it. She's exactly the right person. She understands the gaps from the inside. She's been working inside the system long enough to know where it fails and why." I paused. "I haven't asked her yet. I don't want to pressure her, but yes." "And Lucas?" Daniel asked. His voice was even, neutral. "We need to address the estate plan more broadly." "Yes," I said. "We do." This was the part I had been both preparing for and dreading. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had known for several days, with a clarity I hadn't expected to achieve so soon, but because knowing what you want to do and doing it are separated by the distance of actually sitting with what it costs. Lucas was my son. Whatever he had become, whatever decisions he had made, whatever he had taken, whatever he had been willing to do to the woman who had raised him, he was still my son. And there was a part of me that would never be fully finished grieving the version of him that might have been. That 12-year-old on the dock was real. He had existed. He had been mine, and I had loved him completely. And that love did not simply evaporate because the person it had been given to turned out to be capable of this. But love, real love, the kind that has any integrity left to it, does not require you to participate in your own destruction. It does not mean absorbing every harm without consequence. It does not mean writing a blank check to someone who has demonstrated, repeatedly and specifically, that they will cash it. I rewrote the estate plan with Daniel over the course of 2 long sessions. The foundation received the substantial endowment I had committed to. A portion of the remaining estate was directed towards specific individuals and causes that Robert and I had cared about across our lives together. People and institutions that had mattered, quietly, in the background of our years. And Lucas received what I had decided to call a symbolic inheritance, a fixed sum, meaningful enough to be taken seriously, limited enough to be clearly intentional. Not a punishment, exactly. Not a vindication. Just a precise accounting of what the relationship had earned. "He's going to contest this," Daniel said when we had finished. "I know. He's going to argue it was made under undue influence. He'll probably bring up your age, your surgery, the recovery, try to establish that you weren't in full possession of your faculties when these decisions were made. I know that too. We'll document everything meticulously. Cognitive assessments, witnessed signatures, dated correspondence. He won't win. The case is too solid on your side, but it will be unpleasant." Daniel, I said, I've been managing unpleasant things my entire life. I think I can handle this one. He almost smiled. Almost. There was one more thing I needed to do, and it was the hardest. Not because it required courage in the way that confrontations do, but because it required me to say something true to the person it would hurt most, without softening it into something it wasn't. I wrote Lucas a letter. I wrote it by hand, at my kitchen table, over the course of an entire afternoon. I rewrote it 3 times. What I wanted to say and what I was capable of saying kept arriving at different lengths, different temperatures, different levels of precision. The first draft was too angry. The second was too forgiving. The third was the closest I could get to the truth without tipping into either extreme. I told him I knew about the transfers. I told him I knew about the debt. I told him I knew about the power of attorney request for what it was, stripped of the language of concern that had been used to present it. I told him I had loved him for 53 years and intended to go on loving him, but that love and trust were not the same thing, and he had spent years spending down one account while assuming the other was unlimited. I told him that forgiveness was something I was working toward, that I was not there yet, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but that the door was not closed, that the door was never fully closed because he was my son, and that fact did not come with an expiration date. And I told him that trust, real trust, the kind that allows 2 people to have a genuine relationship, had to be earned back the same way it had been lost, slowly, through action, over time, that there were no shortcuts, that no amount of explanation or apology, however sincere, would substitute for the long, unglamorous work of becoming someone worth trusting. I cannot give you what I've given you my whole life, I wrote, near the end. Not because I've stopped loving you, but because I finally understand that what I thought was love, the part where I kept saying yes when the answer should have been no, was not love. It was fear dressed up in love's clothes. And I am too old and too tired, and it turns out, too wealthy to be afraid anymore. I sealed the envelope. I held it in my hands for a moment. Then I set it on the table to give to Daniel, who would ensure it was delivered after the legal matters were properly arranged. Lucas showed up at my house on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the paperwork had been filed. I had known he would, eventually. Sandra was there, and I had asked Emily if she could come by that morning under the pretense of a regular visit. Not as protection, exactly, but because her presence in my house had a steadying effect on me that I had stopped apologizing for needing. He knocked. I answered the door myself, walker and all, because I was not going to receive him from a chair while someone else let him in. That mattered to me, in a way that would have been hard to explain to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime managing the subtle power dynamics of a relationship built on one person's perpetual yielding. He looked worse than I expected. The carefully groomed confidence had thinned. There were circles under his eyes that the right light would have revealed at Meridian, but the candlelit corner booth had concealed. He was wearing clothes that were still good, but wearing them differently. The way people wear good clothes when the good clothes are what remains of a life that has otherwise slipped. "Mom," he said. He glanced behind me and saw Emily in the hallway. Something shifted in his expression. "I need to talk to you, alone." "Emily stays," I said. "She's a friend. She's welcome in my home." His jaw tightened. "Mom, this is a family matter. Come in or don't," I said. "But I'm not negotiating the terms of who's in my own house." He came in. We sat in the living room. Sandra disappeared into the kitchen with the particular discretion of someone who has spent years knowing when to be elsewhere. Emily sat in the armchair by the window. Not intrusively, not as a statement, but simply as a presence, steady and quiet. Lucas sat across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I watched him. I had been looking at this face for 53 years, had watched it move through infancy and childhood, and the particular rawness of adolescence and the long, slow settling of adulthood. I knew every version of it. I knew the one he was wearing now, the version that was calculating while performing sincerity. I had seen it at Meridian, I had heard it in his voicemails, but seeing it here, in my own living room, in the house where he had grown up, was different. It was worse. "I know you've talked to Mercer," he said. "I know what you've done with the accounts, with the trust." A pause. "Mom, I think you've made some decisions without fully understanding." "Lucas," I said. "Stop." He stopped. I know about the $67,000, I said. I know about the loans, the commercial real estate, the business partnership. I know what you owe and I know roughly what you have, and I know that the gap between those two numbers is the real reason you wanted power of attorney. I held his gaze. I know all of it. The silence was total. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Something happened to his face. The calculation fell away from it, or at least fell back, retreated behind something that looked, for the first time in as long as I could remember, like something genuine. It might have been shame. It might have been relief that the pretending was over. It might have been both. I had stopped being certain I could read him accurately, and I wasn't going to claim more than I could honestly see. Mom, I'm not finished. I had not raised my voice. I didn't need to. I'm not going to prosecute you. That's a decision I made, and it's not because I'm afraid or because I don't know what my options are. It's because it wouldn't give me what I actually want, and what I actually want has nothing to do with watching you suffer. I paused. But make no mistake, the estate is arranged as I intended, and it will not be changed, not by pressure, not by legal challenge, not by any argument about my competency, which I would strongly advise you not to attempt. He flinched at that, actually flinched. I wrote you a letter, I said. Daniel will give it to you. I want you to read it, not respond to it immediately. Just read it and sit with it. And I want you to understand that I am not closing the door on you, but I am done holding it open from the inside while you decide whether or not to walk through. Lucas sat in the chair that had been his father's favorite chair, in the house where he had been a child, and he looked at me, really looked at me, and I watched something move across his face that I couldn't categorize. It wasn't the look of a man who had gotten what he wanted. It wasn't the look of a man who had won anything at all. He left 20 minutes later. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He said very little, actually, a few fragmented sentences that added up to neither apology nor accusation, but something in between, the verbal equivalent of a man who doesn't yet know how to hold what has just happened to him. I closed the front door. I stood in my hallway with my hand still on the knob. My hip ached with the dull persistence it had developed since the surgery, and my chest was doing something complicated that I didn't have a clean name for. Emily appeared at the end of the hall. "You okay?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "I will be," I said. "That's different from okay, but it's true." She nodded. She walked toward me and put her hand briefly on my arm. Not a hug, not a speech, just a hand on an arm for a moment, warm and solid, and there. It was enough. It was more than enough. I walked back to the kitchen where the afternoon light was doing its slow march across the floor, and I sat down at the table where I had opened the bank statements and read the trust document and written the letter and made every decision I had made over the past weeks. I sat there and breathed and thought about what it meant to choose yourself, not in the abstract, aspirational way that phrase gets used, but in the specific, costly, unglamorous way that it actually happens. The way you give something up that you've been holding for decades. The way the release of it is grief and freedom simultaneously, and you can't separate them, and maybe you're not supposed to. Outside, a car moved down the street. Ordinary afternoon sounds, the house settling around me in its familiar way. I was still here, still mine. That was enough to start with. The letter I had written to Lucas sat in Daniel's office for 9 days before it was delivered. I know this because I counted. Not obsessively. I wasn't checking a clock or a calendar every hour. But the awareness of it lived in the background of those 9 days the way certain things do when you've done something irreversible and the world hasn't yet confirmed whether it was the right thing. I went about my life. I did my physical therapy exercises each morning in the slow, incremental way that recovery demands. Not the triumphant linear progress you imagine before surgery, but the real version, where some days are better than the day before and some days are worse, and you learn to stop measuring yourself against a projected timeline and just show up to the work. I cooked simple things. I read. I called Emily more than I probably needed to, and she never made me feel like I was calling too often, which was its own form of grace. Daniel called on the 9th day to confirm the letter had been received. His attorney called, Daniel told me. Lucas retained someone. A younger attorney. Aggressive reputation. They're going to push back on the estate revisions. I had expected this. What's their angle? Undue influence. They'll argue that your relationship with Emily Carter, a person you met only weeks before making significant financial decisions, suggests you were being manipulated by someone with a financial interest in your estate. I sat with that for a moment. The audacity of it was almost impressive. My son, who had been quietly moving money out of my account for 22 months, was going to argue that I was the one being manipulated. By the nurse who had sat with me at 2 in the morning because she had chosen to. By the woman who had never asked me for a single thing. Emily has no financial interest in my estate, I said. No. But they'll construct a narrative suggesting she cultivated the relationship deliberately. It's a standard tactic. Identify someone the vulnerable party has grown close to and frame that relationship as predatory. She's not predatory. She's the only person who showed up. I know that, Daniel said, and we'll demonstrate it clearly. Her employment records, her history of patient advocacy, the timeline of your relationship, all of it will work in your favor. But Margaret, I want you to be prepared for this to be said out loud in a formal setting. It's going to be unpleasant to hear. Daniel, I said, my son is going to stand in front of a judge and argue that a nurse who sat with me at 2 in the morning was running a con while he was the one transferring $67,000 out of my account. A pause. I think I can handle unpleasant. I told Emily that evening. I told her carefully, watching her face as I explained what Lucas's attorney intended to argue. I watched the sequence of emotions move across her. First confusion, then understanding, then something that settled into a kind of quiet anger that she held with the same containment she brought to everything difficult. They're going to say I targeted you, she said. Not a question. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Does that change things for you? Between us? The question surprised me. Not that she asked it, but how plainly she asked it. No performance of hurt, no plea for reassurance, just a direct, honest question from someone who understood that the accusation, however false, had to land somewhere. Emily, I said, the only person who has ever given me a reason to question your motives is Lucas. And the reason he's doing it is because your motives are the cleanest thing in this entire situation. You are the inconvenient fact that doesn't fit his story, so he's going to try to make you fit a different one. She looked at me across the kitchen table. I don't want to be the reason this gets harder for you. You're not the reason, I said. He is. A long pause. Then, I'll talk to whoever you need me to talk to. I'll provide whatever documentation helps. I'm not going anywhere. She said it simply, without drama. And it struck me, the way things strike you sometimes when you're not braced for them, that this was what loyalty actually looked like. Not the loud, performative declarations of family obligation. Not of course I'll be there, Mom, said in a kitchen while someone's eyes drift toward the window. Just, I'm not going anywhere, said quietly, and meant. The legal challenge lasted 4 months. I will not pretend those months were easy. They were not. Lucas's attorney was as aggressive as Daniel had warned, thorough and relentless in the way that lawyers are when they're working to construct a reality from materials that don't quite fit it. There were depositions. There were document requests. There were long hours in rooms with too much fluorescent lighting and too little air, speaking carefully in response to questions designed to find the crack in a story that had no crack because it was simply true. Emily gave her deposition on a Tuesday morning in early July. I was not in the room for it. Daniel had advised against my presence. But she called me afterward from the parking lot, and I could hear in her voice that it had been bad. Not what she'd said. She was confident about that. But how it had felt to sit across from someone who had been paid to suggest, with the language of legal inquiry, that her friendship with me was a long con. That her presence in my hospital room at 2 in the morning had been a calculated move, that she had looked at a 72-year-old woman alone before surgery and seen an opportunity. How are you? I asked. A pause. I've had better Tuesdays. I'm sorry. Don't be. I knew what it was going in. Another pause. Can I come over later? I'll make dinner, I said. Real dinner, not takeout. She laughed. A short, tired laugh, but real. You're not supposed to be on your feet that long yet. My hip is my business, I said. Come at 6. I made soup. It took twice as long as it used to, and my hip registered its opinion at every stage. But I made it, and when Emily arrived at 6 and smelled it from the doorway, something in her face loosened from the tension it had been carrying all day. We ate without talking much. Some meals are like that. Not silent in an uncomfortable way, but quiet in the way of two people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it to each other. When the bowls were empty, Emily wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and looked at me. "It's going to be okay," she said. "The case, I mean. Daniel seems sure." "He is. Are you?" I thought about it honestly. "About the legal outcome, yes. About everything else," I paused. "I think okay is something I'm building, not something I've arrived at. That's probably the right way to think about it. Emily," I set down my own mug, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to say no if the answer is no. No obligation. No, none of the weight of what's happened between us should factor into your answer. Just your honest answer." She looked at me steadily. "Ask?" "The foundation," I said. "The Holloway Hope Foundation. I want to establish a center, a physical center, not just a grant-making body. A place where elderly people who are isolated during medical events can receive support, companionship programs, home recovery assistance, hospital advocacy. The gaps." I held her gaze. "I want you to help lead it. As director of operations. I know that means leaving the hospital. I know that's enormous. I know—" "Yes," she said. I stopped. I hadn't finished. "Margaret," a small smile. "I've been thinking about this since the night you first described it. I just didn't want to say anything because I didn't want you to think I had any—" "Don't," I said. "Don't say what you were going to say. I know why you hesitated, and I know what it cost you to wait, and I know what it says about your character that you did." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers briefly. "Say yes again." "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." The court ruled in my favor in late August. Lucas's challenge was dismissed on every substantive point. The judge's written ruling was, according to Daniel, unusually direct, noting that the documentation of Margaret Holloway's mental acuity, her careful and deliberate decision-making process, and the absence of any credible evidence of undue influence made the petition not merely unsuccessful, but largely without foundation. Daniel called me from his car, which he never did. He was a man of offices and formal settings, and his voice had a warmth in it that told me he had been more invested in the outcome than his professional manner had revealed. "It's done," he said. "Completely?" "Completely. The estate stands as written. The foundation's endowment is secured. Everything Robert built is intact." I sat in my living room, in the chair across from Robert's old chair, where Lucas had sat on that Saturday morning, and I breathed. "Thank you," I said. "For everything, Daniel. Robert was right about you." A brief pause. "He was right about you too," he said. "Whatever he told you, he was right." The Holloway Hope Center opened its doors on a Thursday morning in March, exactly 1 year, almost to the day, from the morning of my surgery. I had not planned the timing consciously, but when Daniel pointed it out a week before the opening, it struck me as exactly right. 1 year from the ventilation system humming in a hospital room. 1 year from 14 unanswered calls. 1 year from 2 in the morning and a nurse who sat down in a chair and stayed. The center occupied a converted building on the east side of the city, a former community health clinic that had closed 3 years earlier, renovated now into something warm and specifically designed for its purpose. Quiet rooms for respite, a coordination hub for the hospital companion program, a training center for volunteer advocates, a kitchen where meals were prepared for people coming home from procedures to empty houses. Emily had overseen the renovation with the same focused, practical intelligence she brought to everything. Making decisions, I was told by the contractors, with an efficiency that surprised people who expected a nonprofit director to be primarily occupied with feelings rather than logistics. She was both. She was very good at both. I stood at the entrance that Thursday morning and watched people arrive. Volunteers, hospital staff who had partnered with us, social workers, a small cluster of reporters from local outlets who had picked up the story carefully, because I had been careful about what story I offered them. Not the drama of Lucas, not the legal fight, just the foundation and what it was for and why. Emily came to stand beside me at some point. She looked different, not in appearance, but in how she occupied herself. There was a settled quality to her that I recognized as a person doing the work they were actually meant to do. "How does it feel?" I asked. She looked around at the space, at the people moving through it, at the light coming through the windows, at the volunteer at the front desk who was already on the phone with a hospital discharge coordinator. "Like something that should have existed a long time ago," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "It should have." Lucas wrote to me in October. Not through his attorney, not through Daniel. A letter, handwritten, mailed to my house. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope, the same slightly cramped, leftward-leaning script I had been reading on birthday cards and school papers, and the occasional note left on my kitchen counter for 45 years. I sat with it unopened for 2 days. I'm not going to describe what it said in full, because some things belong to the private interior of a relationship and not to its public accounting. But I will say this. It was not the letter of a man who had found a new strategy. It was not smooth or carefully constructed or deployed with the specific timing of someone executing a plan. It was halting and uneven, and in places crossed out and rewritten in ways you could see through the page. The physical evidence of someone struggling to say a true thing after years of saying calculated ones. He acknowledged what he had done. Not all of it, and not with the precision of a legal document. There were gaps and softened edges that I noticed and did not excuse. But the core of it was there. The transfers. The dinner at Meridian. The power of attorney request and what it had actually been. He did not blame Renee, which surprised me. He did not offer explanations that were really excuses wearing explanations' clothes, which surprised me more. He said he had lost almost everything. The house was in foreclosure. The business debts were in settlement negotiations that would consume most of what remained. Renee had left in June, quietly, efficiently, with the same smooth competence with which she had always operated, leaving behind a life that had apparently been conditional on a prosperity that no longer existed. He did not ask me for money. I want to say that clearly because it matters. The letter contained no request, no proposition, no careful language designed to reopen a financial door. He said only that he was working. A management position at a logistics company, unglamorous, sufficient, and that he was trying to understand who he had been and whether he could become someone different. "I read your letter 100 times," he wrote. "The part about trust being earned back through action over time. I don't know if I have enough time left to earn it, but I'm going to try anyway, because I don't know what else to do with the years I have left, except try to be better than I was." I folded the letter and put it in the drawer of my nightstand, where I keep the few things I return to when I need to remember something important. Robert's watch, a photograph of the lake house in August, the card Emily had left for me when Sandra's service ended, with a note that said simply, "You know where I am." I did not write back immediately. I needed time, not to decide whether I would respond, but to figure out what the response that was actually true looked like. The one that didn't rush toward reconciliation because reconciliation is comfortable, but also didn't foreclose it because foreclosure is a different kind of lie. I wrote back in November. 2 pages. My handwriting, which had always been neater than his. I told him I had read his letter. I told him I believed him. Not completely, not without reservation, but enough to respond. I told him that forgiveness was a process and not an event, and that I was somewhere in the middle of it, and that I was not going to pretend to be further along than I was. I told him that the door was open the width of one honest conversation, and that if he wanted to have it, he could call Daniel's office and arrange a time. He called the following week. The conversation lasted an hour and 20 minutes. It was not clean or resolved or comfortable. There were silences that lasted long enough to be painful, and moments where one of us said something true that the other one needed time to absorb. There were no grand declarations. At the end, we did not have a repaired relationship. What we had was the raw, uncertain beginning of something that might, over time, with consistent effort on both sides, become one. That was enough. Not everything, but enough to matter. On a Sunday afternoon in December, I sat in my living room with Emily and Sandra, who had stayed connected long past the formal end of her assignment, in the way of people who become part of your life without anyone quite deciding it. And we had a meal together that stretched into the early evening. No occasion, no agenda, just people who had chosen each other, eating food that Emily had cooked because she had turned out to be an unexpectedly good cook, talking about small things and occasionally large ones, while the December light outside went from silver to blue to the particular shade of dark that arrives early in the short days of winter. At some point, Sandra said something that made Emily laugh, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. And I sat there watching them and felt something that I want to be honest about, because this story has tried, throughout, to be honest about things rather than neat. It was not uncomplicated happiness. There was still grief in me for what Lucas and I had lost and for what we were slowly, imperfectly rebuilding. There was still the ache of knowing that the family I had imagined for myself, the one where blood and love were the same thing, where showing up was guaranteed, had never fully existed. There was still the low, persistent knowledge that I was 72 years old, and my hip reminded me of its opinion every morning, and time moves in one direction. But underneath all of that, or perhaps alongside it, not replacing it, but coexisting with it the way real things do, there was something else. Something that had been quietly growing since the morning I woke up in a hospital room and counted the hours and the calls and understood for the first time that I had been waiting for a rescue that was never coming, and that the only rescue available was the one I would have to build myself. I had built it, imperfectly, expensively, with help I had not known to ask for from a person I had not known to look for. But I had built it, and it was real, and it was mine. Robert had built walls around my future, and I had finally learned to stand inside them. I want to say one more thing before this story ends. One thing directly, without the shelter of narrative or character or the comfortable distance of fiction. If you're listening to this and you have someone in your life who is waiting for you, really waiting, the way I waited in that hospital room, the way so many people wait in so many rooms just like it, I want you to consider what it costs them. Not in money. In the particular irreversible currency of time and dignity and the quiet accumulation of unanswered calls. I want you to think about what it means to be the person who does not come. And if you are the one waiting, if you are the one who has spent years absorbing things that should have been refused, saying yes to people who have never met you halfway, keeping peace at the cost of your own dignity and your own sense of what you deserve, I want you to hear this. You are not obligated to fund someone else's future at the expense of your own present, not with money, not with silence, not with the constant, exhausting work of pretending that things are fine when they are not. The people who love you, who actually love you, the real kind, not the transactional kind, do not need you to diminish yourself to keep them comfortable. The ones who ask you to are telling you something important. Listen to it. Real family is not always the one you were born into. Sometimes it's the person who sat down in the chair at 2 a.m. Sometimes it's the woman with the swallow tattoo who showed up at 6 with soup and stayed until the light changed. Sometimes it's built from scratch, out of choice and consistency and the ordinary, extraordinary decision to stay. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 73 years old. I walked into a hospital 1 year ago believing that the people who were supposed to love me would show up. They didn't. And I built something anyway. And the woman who sat down in the chair is now leading a center that has served over 200 people in its first year. 200 people who needed someone to show up and for whom someone did. That is what Robert's careful, patient work made possible. That is what my willingness to finally stop absorbing and start choosing made possible. That is what Emily's decision to sit down at 2 a.m. in a hospital chair for no reason except that it was the right thing to do made possible. Legacy is not the number in an estate document. Legacy is what you do with the years after you finally understand what they're for. I am still learning. I am still building. Some mornings my hip reminds me that I am not what I was. And some mornings, Lucas's number appears on my phone, and I have to decide, again, who I want to be in relation to him. And there is no final answer to that, only the ongoing, imperfect work of it. But I am here. I am present. I am mine. And for the first time in longer than I can honestly remember, that is more than enough.